Greetings. I'm Dr. Chan, neuropsychologist and psychotherapist in Miami, faculty at Pepperdine University, and the founder of the Center for Neuropsychology and Consciousness. Welcome to the CNC Dialogues. My next guest is Dr. Dan Siegel. He received his medical degree from Harvard University and completed his education at UCLA. Dr. Siegel is the executive director of the Mindsight Institute and founding co-director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA. He is one of the founders of Interpersonal Neurobiology and has lectured for the King of Thailand, Pope John Paul II, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Google University, and London's Royal Society of Arts. Dr. Siegel has published numerous books, many which became New York Times bestsellers. My personal favorites are The Mindful Therapist and The Handbook of Interpersonal Neurobiology. His two latest publications include Intra-Connected and Personality and Wholeness in Therapy. He played a major influential role in my life and remains a great colleague and, I'm proud to say, friend. In this episode, we begin by defining the mind through the lens of science. We then discuss differences between the mind, the self, and consciousness, further diving into how our understanding of the self diminishes our experience. Useful acronyms and the origin stories to many of the ideas central to his thinking were revealed in this episode. When talking to Dan, meditation, quantum physics, neuroscience, psychology, and mathematics are seamlessly knit together to bring about the nature of mental life. Finally, we end on exciting rapid-fire questions to better understand who Dan is as a person. If any of these topics sound interesting to you, feel free to skip around. So I'd like us to start with the mind. You define the mind as an embodied, relational, emergent, self-organizing process that regulates the flow of energy and information. All right, did I miss anything?
Well, that's one very important aspect of the mind. Of course, the mind
Okay,
has consciousness and subjective experience and information processing too, but
right.
that one you defined is a definition that is very useful to start with.
Okay, good. So that definition is quite densely packed, and we're definitely going to touch on all the other topics that you brought up, hopefully, if we have the time. But what I wanted to do is begin breaking this down for the audience. And so, as an example, right, the first one was embodied. And for the mind to be embodied, that would mean that the mind is not just the brain, which you've mentioned several times in many of your books, but actually extends all throughout the body, such as the gut brain, which we now know can influence cognition, personality, even and emotions, and even the heart brain. And I'm wondering if you could expand a little more on these different areas of intelligence.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a long line of statements that say from the time of Hippocrates, 2,500 years ago, that all of our joys and sorrows, it's written, come from what's happening inside your head and inside your head alone. And that focus on the subjective experience of joys and sorrows, the
Mhm.
elements of mind only coming from your head's brain, has been kind of the way people think, not just in medicine,
Mhm.
Hippocrates being a grandfather of modern medicine, but also William James in 1890 said it, saying that, we know, we've confirmed, and let's just go on from there, that the mind is simply coming from the activity of the brain,
Mhm.
this organ in your head.
Mhm.
So when I was trained in psychiatry and heard that, it was familiar to me, of course. It's what we learned in medical school, but it just seemed like a partial truth
Mhm.
that what we speak about in terms of the emotions we have, like you were just referring to, being influenced by all of what's going on in the body, at least means that the mind is not just enskulled,
Mhm.
that it has something to do with something that's going on in the whole body.
Mhm.
So that's one part of it. And then when I became an attachment researcher, and you you would study basically a parent-child's relationship. I know you have a young one at home, so you're probably seeing this all the time with your child. You
Mhm.
know, you can feel the relational connection
Mhm.
that is doing something,
Mhm.
and my experience when I was in medical school, I was trained by David Hubel, who showed that the energy streaming through the eyes can shape the connections in the brain. And he won the Nobel Prize in 1981 for that when I was in school with him.
Mhm.
And it really influenced me, the idea that something like about light entering eyes, activating the neurons in the brain could change brain structure. Well, what if this thing that was the relational connection between an infant and a child in terms of attachment research was a similar kind of energy? Certainly, you would see things, you would hear things, you would feel things, smell things.
Mm,
All those are examples of energy flow. So that made me realize that you can sense the mind in the betweenness
mm,
between a child and a parent. And that thing that could be both between and within was energy flow. And that's where the embodied and relational part of that definition comes from.
mm,
And it's about energy flow, which isn't something that was being talked about, but it felt like that met with the scientific criteria, certainly that David Hubel had taught me about.
mhm,
And also in my attachment research, it was what we were studying. What were the energy patterns we call information that were being shared? So it just became a matter of opening up one's mind, if you will, to
mm,
this notion that mind could be both within and between. That's the embodied and relational part. And we
mm.
can come to the emergent self organizing aspect
Right.
next.
Yeah, I just wanted to also comment. I do find it quite fascinating when we think about the embodied nature. When we look at the different somatic disorders or psychogenic sort of conditions, where conditions are born of the mind. Lots of people, when they think about a psychological diagnosis or whatnot, they think it's simply, the brain expressing itself in some way, and that the mind or what our inner experience has no influence over it. But there is a whole subset of conditions, like individuals who have psychogenic seizures, right? Seizures that are born from the mind, and there is no commensurate or root to that when they look at the brain, right?
Yeah.
And so it's quite fascinating. And then we put people through a whole bunch of batteries, making sure that they're not just making stuff up, and that and some people are, but there also definitely is a fair percentage that are not making things up and are really experiencing these seizures as if they're real, or other conditions, conversion disorder, where people are not being able to see or blinded, right? Based off of perhaps a trauma that's occurred when they were younger, or whatever the case is. The point here is that there are several instances, enough to be placed in the DSM-5, that show us how the mind can empower, not empower, but impact our capacity to function. Um,
Totally. I think that's right, Aldrich. And I think for me that was so hard at first to really embrace, but then once you kind of begin to sit with it, it kind of feels right and makes sense and fits the science actually, and the clinical work, as you're pointing out, is the notion that mind as a regulatory process that is governing, that is, it's monitoring and it's modifying energy flow.
mm,
So when we say something's a regulatory process, like when you regulate a bicycle, what it means is that you're doing two things. You're monitoring something,
mm,
like watching where the bike is going or feeling the balance of the bike. And then you're also not just sensing it, but you're shaping it. You're able to transform it in
mm,
addition to tracking it. So this modification is, you press on the brakes or you pedal faster or you steer left or steer right, and so in this modifying way, the mind as a regulatory process can shape how energy is flowing through the body, including its brain.
mm,
So one example would be, like, let's talk about a television set just as an analogy. Like, let's say you were watching Forrest Gump, the wonderful movie Forrest Gump, and you're watching it on your television, right? In
mm,
the screen. Now, if you took apart that screen and tried to find Tom Hanks and Sally Field, the main actors of the film, and said, look, we saw them on the screen, so they've got to be in here. It's obvious, isn't it? I mean, here's a screen. There's Tom Hanks. There's Sally Field in the film Forrest Gump. They got to be in there. We have
mm,
evidence they were on the screen. So if they're on the screen, then they're in the TV or in the components of this monitor, the screen. You wouldn't find them there. So
mhm,
it's more. It may be more like the brain in the head is the process through which energy is flowing rather than, and it's that flowing pattern that creates our subjective experience. So we'll talk about the notion of emergence.
Mm,
Maybe we should talk about it now. From a complexity science point of view, in the
mm,
1980s, mathematicians got together, studied complex systems. They showed that the interaction of elements of certain kinds of systems, called complex systems, give rise to something larger than the components themselves.
mm,
So it's much like what Buckminster Fuller would talk about in the 70s
mm.
as synergy and
Right,
synergetics,
right. Which
right?
some
So this,
people express as 1+1 = 3, right?
well,
And
exactly. It's
yeah,
this whole is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of its
like
parts.
a gestalt, right?
What's that?
Like a gestalt.
It's like a gestalt. It's like the
Yeah,
wetness
yeah.
of water is not in any single water molecule. It's in the
Mm,
interaction of the water molecules themselves.
right.
So it's a verb-like interactive process, not a noun-like entity thing. And this is where some people get really stuck because they think mind is a noun. It's a thing you
Mm,
have rather than a process you experience. And so this process is interaction.
hmm,
So the word emergent in the definition you gave is saying that the mind is some aspect of a complex system, and that from a mathematical point of view, we would call it an emergent property.
mm,
And whether that's subjective experience or consciousness or information processing, those are all possibly emergent aspects of energy flow. But the fourth aspect of this description of mind is actually a definition. You described it. They're embodied and relational, that's the
hmm,
location. Emergent is the complex system property, it's
hmm,
emerging. And one of those emergent properties is called self organization.
hmm,
And that is this really non intuitive but mathematically proven aspect of complex systems that they regulate their own becoming,
hmm,
which is, you say, well, where's the conductor, where's the writer of this story, where's the orchestra conductor? Well,
hmm,
there isn't one. It's just an innate aspect of complex systems. So when I proposed this back in 1992, to a group of scientists that couldn't agree on what the mind was, they could all agree on what the brain was. And I said that definition that you said, 40 out of 40 people raised their hand and said, I can go with that. I never said that or thought that,
hmm.
but that fits with what I've been spending my life doing, whether they're anthropologists or neuroscientists.
Right.
And we went on to meet for 4.5 years. Instead of the group dissolving in conflict, we actually went on for 4.5 years of collaboration. And that's where the field of interpersonal neurobiology was born,
Mm,
was realizing you could find a consilient, is the way I would say it now.
mm,
That word wasn't drawn back, as E.O. Wilson did, into our vocabulary. It was from the 1800s. But
mm,
consilience means when independent pursuits find a common ground,
mhm,
then we call it consilient. So I would, in retrospect, say we were on a consilient journey back in those early 90s. And that's where the interpersonal neurobiology field that could use this consilient approach could offer a definition of the mind, which is
mhm.
something that's sort of predicted future research outcomes in the last, 30 years, over
Yeah,
30 years since it was proposed.
yeah, absolutely. And the word interpersonal, that also bridges us into the relational component of the definition. And I guess, when I think of relational, I think of many things. When I think about from a neural perspective, we might think of mirror neurons, neurons that fire with the mere observation of another person performing an action, or some fascinating studies by V.S. Ramachandran demonstrating how we really are just separated by our skin. Um, uh, just for the viewers out there, he basically in a paper, he anesthetized somebody's arm, and it's like as you're watching me touch my arm right now, right? There's a signal coming down, but there's a signal coming back up telling you it's not your arm being touched. But if your arm is anesthetized and you're watching someone else's arm being touched, you could actually feel that person's touch on your arm. And so that's absolutely, lots of fascinating work that's been continually building on this idea that we are inherently social animals and extremely well interconnected. And even our default mode network, which you call the oats network for others and the self, I've been calling it moats, by the way, for add on mental time travel. um, so that inspired that. But in any case, again, it's even the main network dedicated to self-referential processing and introspection and so forth is also very much overlapping with our understanding of other people. And so, um, uh, uh, I don't know. I guess I'm just sort of throwing things out there. Anything else come
Yeah.
to your
No,
mind?
that's beautiful. I think Aldrich, I think the way you're describing it is beautiful. And for everybody listening, we need to remember that as energy flows and we filter it through language. So
Mm,
you're listening to Aldrich say things, you're listening to me say things, you're having your own thoughts in your own mind. Um, when those energy patterns get embedded into a language format that's information processing,
mm,
it symbolizes something. So we have to be careful that once we
mm,
think in words, whatever we associate with the beliefs, the definitions, the construct of that word, that linguistic symbol,
mm,
it's going to go back down in what's called a top down filter and then shape, like you describe in your first book, Aldrich, beautifully.
mm,
It's going to shape what you actually perceive based on what you conceive,
mm.
right? So we have this funny statement, there's no such thing as immaculate perception.
Right.
It's always a top down thing, and that's in contrast to sensation, which certainly is shaped by the fact we live in a body, but it's as close to raw bottom up as you can get. So I say that because words like self or words like mind, they have certain constructs, and we need to make sure we're not being imprisoned by them.
Hmm.
And so, one of the things I think it's coming out in our conversation right now is the idea that there's something about the interaction, the relational, the interpersonal, if it's about humans. And the reason I chose that word for the name of the field was it started with the prefix inter,
Right.
but it also respected the inner, the personal.
Mm,
And so I didn't
mhm,
use the word social. It was before there was a field called social neuroscience, by the way. This interpersonal phrase for interpersonal neurobiology was trying to say there's a betweenness and a withinness, and they're both important
mm,
and they're different and they're both part of one whole.
mm,
So that's where interpersonal came from. The neurobiology was just that, can we embrace the neuroscience? These days, I realize, it was maybe favoring neuroscience over any of the other sciences. And
mhm.
I'm not so happy about that. But we now have over 100 books, of which yours is one.
Mm,
And Luke Cozzolino, I know, was on here, and Diana Navez, hers is in there. We have all these books in the series. We have 100 now.
right.
I just think I published the 101st book
Mhm.
in the series um, on personality and temperament. But what's fun about it is it invites people to think about this interpersonal neurobiology
Right.
view,
Mhm,
which takes a conciliant stance and says every science, every discipline that carefully looks at reality, even spiritual practices, even the arts, even deep contemplative practices that look inward at the mind,
mm,
indigenous teachings, um, different religions have a lot to offer, the study of history, even philosophy. I mean, you can go on and
mhm,
say even this, even that. All of these groups contribute when they're done in a disciplined way to saying, if you're trying to study the nature of truth and articulate it, there's lots of different ways to do that, and they all have something to offer.
mm, mhm. Absolutely. I think when you go to the roots of the word consilience, it means something like the jumping together of
Ah,
information or facts. I thought that was kind of
oh, that's
clever.
beautiful. That's
Yeah.
beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. And the whole field it definitely has blossomed and has emerged into all sorts of other fields have emerged from it, and technologies, even things like hyperscanning, which has been fairly recent, I think, compared to things like the EEG and such, where now they're able to look at brain functioning using different modes um, of two people interacting. And what we're finding is that there's all sorts of synchronization that's occurring between brain waves, or even regions of the brain that are active simultaneously, depending on what task is going on. Like if people are learning a song, or if there's some sort of creative endeavor or collaboration that's happening. It's been so fascinating and great to see uh, the fruits that has been coming from this tree that you've planted for all of us.
Well, that's beautiful. I don't know if it's from a tree I planted or more like a forest that we're all living in, but
Okay.
it's a beautiful thing to be a part of the whole.
Mm,
But here's what I'll say, Aldrich, about what I find so inspiring about the way you're presenting it, and also your book and your work. Is that you can invite people in to bring whatever their own differentiated perspective may be, and take that unique perspective someone might have and see how it fits into the whole. And
mm,
Robin Wall Kimmerer has a beautiful book called Braiding Sweetgrass, where, and I think this probably overlaps with her new one called Service Berries. But in the original book, she has this beautiful statement where in her tradition, in her cultural group, the Potawatomi, um, each person has an obligation to um, really develop their own gifts, but then give those gifts back to the community. So it's a
mm,
differentiation and a linkage. And so, in this definition of mind, actually, what's conciliant about that, with what Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about, is we say that optimal self-organization, this is straight from the math of complex systems,
mm,
comes when you differentiate and you link. And so when we look at a cultural practice like the Potawatomi way of honoring your gifts and giving them back,
mm,
it is a part of what you can call a cultural integration, where the individuals in a society are invited to differentiate, and then they're also invited to link. And
mm,
that balance of differentiation linkage, we just name it as integration. So
mhm,
integration, from that way we're defining it, in a mathematics point of view, is how you optimize self-organization, and that has the qualities of harmony.
mm,
Whereas if you're out of harmony, you either go to one bank outside of this river of harmony called chaos,
mm,
or the other bank is the bank of rigidity.
mm,
So interestingly, and I noticed this when I was first training to be a therapist back in I guess it was the 80s, I just noticed that all of my patients, no matter what the diagnostic category they had been given, or I was going to give them, whatever it was, their fundamental suffering came from being taken over by rigidity or taken over by chaos. And I remember saying to
mhm,
my supervisor, like, what's going on? These people are either chaotic or rigid or both. And they would go, what are you talking about? Just give them a diagnosis. I say, no, I mean, but there's this pattern across diagnoses that
mm,
they're either suffering with rigidity or chaos or some combo of the two. And none of my supervisors would grok that. I mean, they couldn't go with that. They just said, I don't know what you're talking about.
mm,
So I went on this search to try to say, why am I seeing this? Am I like nuts? Am I just like a simpleton where I can't remember the DSM, for my
mm,
board exams or something? What is going on here? And then finally I found it in a math book where it said complex systems
mm.
being blocked from optimal self organization move either to chaos or rigidity. And I flipped out, Aldrich. I just went
Right.
nuts.
Yeah.
And I said, oh my God, maybe this has something to do, even though it's in a math book, with the
Mhm.
mind.
Right.
And I think people thought I was out of my mind to turn to math.
Mhm.
And they said, what are you, like a science wonk? And you're just like, but I love math. And I don't think there's a reason from a consilience point of view to separate it out from
Mhm.
art or music or love or,
Right.
therapy or mental health or mind or any of that stuff.
Mhm.
Why wouldn't there be a consilience among all
Mm.
those ways of experiencing
Right.
reality?
And just to piggyback and add on to what you're saying, I think it's also quite fascinating that when the systems are optimized, using your own acronym FACES, they tend to
Yeah.
be flexible, adaptive, coherent, energetic, and stable, which also is quite reflective of successful therapeutic cases when people feel much better. Since you've already been diving into complex systems, maybe we could just talk a little bit about some of the components. I know we've already touched on self organizing, but there are other things like being an open system or nonlinear or chaos capable.
Yeah.
Could you maybe speak to some of those and relate that to personal experiences may be there?
Yeah, yeah, that's beautiful. I when I was reading these math books back in the early 90s, and they said, well, this is the findings of mathematicians studying complex systems. I said, what is a complex system? And this is how they define a complex system. So let's start with system. A system is a collection of stuff. Stuff could be entities, like marbles,
Mm.
molecules of water. It could be all sorts of things. A cloud, for example, is a system of water and air molecules.
Mm.
And it could be the interaction among those component things. So that's the system, is the components and their interactions. So the interactions are verb-like processes, right? So when you look at a complex system, it has three particular characteristics. I'll say the first two, but the third is the most important. The first one is that it's open,
Mm.
which means that this system, like a cloud, needs to be influenced by stuff outside of what you would call the system itself.
Mm.
So, for example, a flock of geese are outside of the cloud, they can influence it. A mountain that a cloud bumps into would be outside the system, but it can influence it, right?
Mm.
Wind would be outside the cloud, but it influences the sun. So, a cloud is an open system, and so are we as human beings, right? Our minds, our mental lives. The second is it's chaos capable. And what that means is you're capable of roughly being, randomly distributed,
Mm.
right? Just chaotic, basically.
Mm.
And, I had a very chaotic day just 2 days ago. Oh my God, I couldn't get anything done. And finally I
Mm.
just took a deep breath. I said, I guess I'm leaning into the bank of chaos today, and this is just the way it's going to go. And I gave up any hope of getting anything done, and I just had fun with it. And
Mm.
chaotic things absolutely happen. And it's like, okay, this is what the system that is life right now is happening. So that's
Right.
chaos capable. And of
Mm.
course, a cloud could be randomly distributed. It turns out it isn't, but it could be. So it's chaos capable, not chaos itself.
Right.
All right. So it is capable of being randomly distributed. Then there's the final one, the most important one, nonlinear. And nonlinear means, a small input, like, a flock of geese, go into a cloud, and it's really hard, maybe not impossible, but really, really hard to predict the relatively huge impact that small flock of geese has for a huge cloud.
Mm.
It's going to have a comparatively, that's what the nonlinear is, huge result from a small input.
Mm.
And when I think about my life, and like if I'm going to go bike riding and I had a flat tire, so I couldn't go bike riding, the huge things that happen because that small perturbation happened on my plans is really not predictable. I
Mm.
cannot predict how the day will be different because the tire was flat. So a little bit of air, not in a rubber tube called my tire,
Mm.
leads to a huge impact, sometimes on the rest of your life. So
Right.
that's what nonlinear means. So um, when you ask people, are you nonlinear? People go, oh yeah. Are you chaos capable? They go, oh yeah. Are you open? Oh yeah. So that's where it was really fun back in the early 90s to say,
Mm.
okay, so the human mind, our mental subjective lives are complex systems. They're
Mhm.
some aspect, they're nonlinear, they're open, they're chaos capable.
Mm.
So that's where that comes from. And the faces flow that you described, was just an acronym. I originally tried to make it Saks Fifth Avenue in one of my classes, but you can tell by what I wear that is not where I go very often for my clothing. So that didn't work. So faces was a much more friendly faces thing,
Right.
and that describes the integrative flow of harmony. And when we talk about it across your life, we talk about it as a river of integration.
Mm.
When we talk about in a given moment of time, we talk about the window of tolerance. So that when you're within the window, you're bounded. One side of the window is chaos, the other is rigidity. But it's the same thing as the river, but only it's now in a slice of time.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. Now, there's one more property I thought was worth just touching on. Well, I'm thinking of the word recursion, which, at least the way I understand it, is like an emergent property that can change that from which it came from. And I guess I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious to know whether you think that's a parallel to something like metacognition, or our ability to think about thinking and perhaps
Oh,
regulate some of that.
well, I never thought about it that way, but it's a brilliant suggestion, Aldrich, as usual from you.
Okay.
Uh, you know, I think that, yeah, in many ways, both metacognition and maybe this is an envelope that fits in with metacognition. I don't know. You can tell me. The notion of open awareness, where you're not just aware of something,
Mm,
but you have this openness. In the research literature, it is sometimes called open monitoring,
mm,
where you're
mhm,
kind of sitting in sort of the chalkboard of the mind, this working space where you're realizing, let's see, Aldrin and I are talking about metacognition. He's talking about the recursive quality. Oh, that's really interesting. And then all sorts of new combinations arise in that, so that metacognition is cognizing about cognition.
mm,
Meta memory would be remembering about memory. Meta emotion would be feeling about feelings.
mm,
The meta is like doing the thing unto itself. So in that sense, yeah, I do think it's a both a recursive thing, but it's also a looping that allows for freedom. So it isn't just like a self-reinforcing loop.
mm,
It's the capacity to, in awareness terms, to have choice and change arise from consciousness itself.
mm,
And, that whole journey for me to try to understand that way, for example, in therapy or in just self reflection, you get the opportunity for choosing a new direction with consciousness. We have a whole course on that at our institute, but that led me on a journey to explore with, literally tens of thousands of
mm,
people in this practice called the Wheel of Awareness.
mhm,
What would happen if you actually made a particular point in the wheel? We use the
mm,
metaphor of the hub, but of
mm,
giving people the skill of just sitting in open awareness.
mhm,
And I do the practice every morning, and it's fascinating to see what it
mhm,
feels like differently every morning. But
mm,
it's this sense of unbelievable freedom. And then, if you want, we can go into it. But
mm,
that led me to try to understand what the hub might be coming from in terms of energy flow,
mm.
and then doing a lot of collaboration with physicists who study energy to propose where consciousness arises from.
Right. So I definitely want to go there. But I think we should start by maybe defining consciousness. And I guess I'm curious, how are you defining consciousness?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I was once teaching in Singapore, uh, and I was teaching with some leaders in the field of contemplative practice,
Hmm.
Buddhist scholars. And one of them had a neuroscience PhD student getting his PhD in the neuroscience of consciousness. And the other had just come out of a cave where I had been there actually to put him into the cave. And 2 years he stayed by himself,
Hmm.
supported with people giving him food. And he had just come out and now was there in Singapore. So we were all having lunch. And I asked that
Right.
question that you just asked me. And I said, "This is amazing. We got these scholars around, but we have these two students that are the same age. They are, they were, in late 20s." I said, and one is doing it through the science route, the other is through the first person immersion contemplative thing. And I was
Hmm.
there when we put you in the cave. So, how do you define consciousness? And neither of them could do it.
Hmm.
The PhD student said, "I have no idea. That's why I'm getting my PhD in it." And the contemplative said, "I have no idea. All I can tell you," because I said, "Well, what'd you learn after 2 years of being in the cave?" He goes, "I'm very distractible." It was this, and their teachers who were there were like, their eyes were popping out of their head. It was it
Oh,
was
it's funny.
it was actually a very humbling and huge moment.
Right.
So I would say for me as a therapist, not getting my doctoral degree in the neuroscience of consciousness or being a contemplative expert or anything like that, but just a therapist trying to help people. Um, it was pretty straightforward.
Hmm.
Do you have the subjective experience of knowing or not?
Hmm.
So let's just name that as being aware.
Hmm.
It's a subjective quality of knowing. So if I say to a patient, um, you know, what do you remember about your childhood? And they go, "I don't remember anything." All we can say in that moment is that they don't have a conscious recollection
Right.
of something,
Hmm.
so that in their subjective knowing, nothing is popping up. Or someone could say, I'm aware that my mother was so gentle with me, even though she was struggling with all sorts of illnesses before she died. I just have this awareness of how much she loved me and how much care she gave me. And then she passed when I was 4,
Mm,
something like that. And in their awareness, they have the subjective knowing
right.
of this love from their mom. And other people say, I have no awareness, right? Which
Hmm.
means I have no subjective knowing.
Hmm.
So the word subjective is not to minimize it. It's just to say there's an internal felt sense
Right.
of knowing that is how I define the awareness of consciousness. And then consciousness also includes that which is known.
Mm,
So consciousness has the knowing facility of awareness
hmm.
and the known of the things you're aware of.
Hmm.
And that's how I define it.
Okay.
And that definition has been super useful at
Hmm.
taking, I've had over 50,000 people do the Wheel of Awareness. And many of them have reported their findings of distinguishing the hub of awareness from the rim of the things that are known. So it's
Hmm.
basically taking the knowing of consciousness, putting it in a hub of a metaphor of a wheel,
Hmm.
taking the knowns and just putting them all around the rim, and then having a singular spoke of attention. And, I just did it as a reflective practice for therapy, and people started getting better from all sorts of things. And then, I started doing it for my students, therapists who are
Hmm.
trying to learn this stuff. And then I started doing it for the general public. And then the workshops just started happening. So I recorded all the results. And
Right.
before the viral pandemic, my assistant counted up, it was over 50,000 people.
Mm,
Now it's probably over, I don't know, 65,000 at this point.
hmm.
Um, in-person meetings where they do the wheel, and and the results are across the planet. It doesn't matter the person's cultural background, education, gender, profession, or anything like that, age. People have very unique experiences on the one hand,
Hmm.
but also very similar experiences, and we can
Mm.
talk about that.
Yeah, I think it's just really interesting, and the wheel of awareness, I think it fits you so well because it integrates different types of meditation, but at the same time, when I think about it from a brain perspective, right, it's you're activating several regions, like when you're focusing on the senses, you may be more highly activating the somatosensory cortex, and when you move into the interoception, the insula is going to get pulled in, right? When you move into the thoughts and so forth. You might get the DMN activation, and then all of a sudden you go up and um, or go back into the hub. And if Pangsep is right, perhaps the subcortical midline structures might be active. And so it's creating this integrative experience that the person's feeling subjectively, but also I wonder objectively speaking. I don't know if you've put someone in an fMRI yet or something like that as you led them through.
I
That would be
can't get
really
anyone to fund it so far.
ah
I've tried. When I was down
okay.
in Florida with you, I was just in the middle of negotiating with someone to fund a project.
I see.
And so far, I think because it's not a classic, often Buddhist practice, that has
Mm,
thousands of years tradition, people
right.
see it as something so new that no one's done it. But it'd be easy to do.
Right.
And if there's anyone listening who wants to fund such
Yeah.
a project, that'd be
I
fun
mean,
to do.
you've had over 50,000 people experience this type of meditation,
Oh,
and you've
yeah.
had amazing feedback. So I imagine that we would see something like what I mentioned, flashing on the screen. I think it would be quite fascinating to see.
It would. And I like my colleagues who do it regularly. I do it every day.
Mm,
You know, you change your state of mind if you're in a funky state and you do it. It like brings you to this state of integrative clarity, that faces flow you're saying, and it's something. It takes about 22 minutes to do, and it also gives you this incredible experience of bending that spoke around. You move it around the rim, but there's a part in an advanced step where you bend the spoke around right into the hub itself, or you just let go of the spoke and just drop into the hub.
hmm.
And there's an incredible freedom and this timelessness and this sense of love and connection that people describe over and over and over again,
Mm,
that I when I was looking for the neural correlates of that, I'll say Aldrich, I couldn't find any for timelessness
mm,
and love and connection, and so I happened to be teaching at a program a long time ago, many years ago, over 15 years ago now, with a bunch of quantum physicists, 300, no, 300. It was 150 quantum physicists and me
Mm.
in an old monastery when I could eat gluten, and it was in Italy. So we had pizza and pasta, and it was just fantastic
Mm.
wandering around this old monastery. And I would say to them, what is energy and what is time? We had time and the energy to look into that.
Mm.
And it was fascinating when they said time isn't something you think it is. It's actually a directionality of change that's only in the Newtonian realm
Mm.
because of the second law of thermodynamics. And that's a whole other story we can talk about. But energy, they defined as the movement from possibility to actuality.
Mm.
And when I was trying to really grasp what they were saying, because it was so new to think of it that way, I mapped it out with some students who were there
Mhm.
to try to
Mhm.
show what I thought the physicists were saying. And the physicist said, yes, that's what we mean. We don't have a drawing for it.
Mhm.
But basically, it's where you have energy as potentiality is in what quantum physicists call the quantum vacuum.
Mhm.
And these are physics terms. Sometimes they use the term sea of potential, or Arthur Zions, who was there, a quantum physics professor, who's now emeritus at Amherst, he would call it the formless source of all form.
Mm.
And it's a mathematical space, and it's a space that is the generator of diversity, is the way I would phrase it.
Mhm.
All of the diversity of probabilities and actualities that arise from this plane of possibilities. In the drawing, it's a plane.
Mm.
Arise into these plateaus of higher probability and these peaks of certainty,
Mhm.
which are called actualities. And so you have peaks, you have plateaus, you have a plane. And what's fascinating about it is the plane of possibility in the drawing, which corresponds to this formless source of all form, this quantum vacuum, is in what's called the quantum realm.
Mhm.
And in 2022, the Nobel Prize was given, for the establishment empirically of what's called non-locality or entanglement. And the point of that is that, quantum physics has demonstrated now not just the hypothesis, but
Mm.
pretty much the acceptance that we have two realms of one reality.
Mhm.
And so what that led to back 15 years ago was the proposal that the wheel of awareness gives us a window into the hub being energy in the timeless state of the quantum realm,
Mm.
and that it's in this sea of potential, which is where the feeling of connection and love come from. That's what I think.
Mm.
And the timelessness, these are all quantum properties.
Mhm.
Um, but then when you move over to the rim, you're up in the plateaus and peaks in our drawing,
Right.
and you're now entering the Newtonian macro state world. And Aldrich, this is such a strange journey, but I was doing this in a workshop once, telling the story that I'm telling you now. And someone said, will you please come to England? And I'm going to have you do the wheel of awareness around the apple tree where Newton figured out gravity. So
Mm.
I said, are you kidding me? She goes, no. So she flew me out to England. We had a documentary filmmaker go there. We actually have this up on our website. And you'll see me in the rainy, misty English day go to the apple tree underneath this house where he was born and where he went during the plague. And he left Cambridge to figure out these laws of gravity and other Newtonian, because he's Isaac Newton. So that's where it was
Right.
called macro state things. And so we paid homage to him and said, look, you did the best you could 350 years ago. You didn't know that 250 years later, some other colleagues in the area of physics would be able to study microstates like electrons and photons and realize there were equally valid properties of the universe, just
Mhm.
that didn't have the same like time boundness and noun like entities of separation in time and space.
Mhm.
Whereas in the quantum realm, there are no nouns, there are no
Mhm.
entities, they're just processes that are
Mhm.
massively connected to one another.
Right.
So that really was a window into, wow, maybe the knowing of awareness. How that happens, we don't know, but maybe it emerges when energy is in this quantum vacuum, is in the source of its origins as potentiality, when it's in the plane of possibility in the drawing. And then as a mechanism, then we can see that states of mind or your mood would be like plateaus, and that from those filtering plateaus that would be subsets of all that could be, would be particular emotions or
Mm.
memories or thoughts. So you could understand, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety issues, mood issues. Basically, you could see the mind on this graph of energy flow, which would
Mhm.
mean where energy is in its movement from possibility to actuality.
Right. Yeah, to bring it to the audience, just in case anyone got a little lost, I'm thinking, this idea of possibility to probability to peaks of activation is one of the ways you called it. It's something that we would do in perhaps psychotherapy, and can use this model, right? This idea that every behavior that may be maladaptive or whatnot are these expressions that are coming from probabilities that have emerged through time and space and through many experiences and biological disposition and so forth. But one of the things we might do is bring someone into these plateaus of probability to help them become aware of what probabilities are there and why they're there, and perhaps help them expand the probable subsets that are existing there, and even better, bring them into that plateau of possibility, perhaps through
The,
the wheel of awareness or
yeah,
some other
the plane of
exercise. The
possibility.
plane of
Yeah,
possibility. Sorry about that.
yeah,
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, let's build on what you're saying, Aldrich. So,
Mm.
based on your reasoning right now, I spent 20 years working with four other scientists to produce this book that just came out called Personality and Wholeness in Therapy. And
Mm.
what it does is it says exactly what you're saying. It says, look, you're born with temperament, which is a particular predisposition of your nervous system, like you can see it in a child, to have certain things that you're sensitive to or certain things you react intensely to.
Mm.
And that this sensitivity intensity that we call temperament reinforces its own ingraining qualities because those neurons that are then activated
Mm.
get neuroplastically more connected to each other just because they're more sensitive because of temperament, which is
Right.
maybe 40% of that is genes, but majority, that is 60% or more, is just from random things, but not learned by experience is the important thing about temperament.
Mm.
So now you have a temperament, and what the PDP model, this is this patterns of developmental pathways model that I developed with four colleagues. What it suggests is that you are basically adapting to your own temperament. And if your attachment was secure, it'll be the most flexible expression of that particular personality pattern
Mm.
because it's coming from temperament. But if your attachment issues were challenging, not secure,
Mm.
then it will intensify the way your personality pattern becomes more like a prison of chaos and rigidity.
Mm.
And that the work in therapy is not to get out of your personality altogether, but move it from the prison of chaos and rigidity, which you may have become,
Mm.
towards a playground of possibility and connection.
Right.
And this allows therapists or coaches or any of us, even in
Mm.
personal development, to then take this model and use it for expanding, where ultimately what you're doing is trying to get beneath all these filters where the plateaus are like personality filters and
Mm.
accessing the plane where you can access all sorts of strengths that you may not have known you have.
Mm. Yeah, I think this is well. First of all, yeah, I would agree. I think the model is great. I think that with when it comes to attachment, one other way I think of it are, at least from a neuroscience perspective, is just the idea that a very great percentage of neural architecture is already forming via experience at an early age, usually when these attachment based experiences are happening. And it's going to develop this expectation system that's going to lead you towards the belief that the world might be dangerous, right? Which may lead you to act chaotic or lead you to act more rigid in different ways. Again, a lot of it's going to depend on your temperament. Um, I think the other thing that kind of came to mind when you talked about layers of personalities, I think of the narrative self or narrative selves, multiple selves, but also this core self or the original self that may be more correlated or connected to consciousness itself. Or I wanted to explore this with you a little bit, just because I also know we're a little pressed for time.
Yeah,
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the self. I know that I think you use the acronym SPA for this, right? Specifically, there's the subjective sensation, right, of being alive. You have perspective and agency, and I think you expand on that because I think SPA relates more towards like what traditional scientists would say, right? How do you distinguish between the self and the mind and consciousness? Do you just view them all as aspects of the mind, or?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's a great question, Aldrich. I love the way you think of things and ask questions about them. So let's look at those three words. We've defined consciousness as the experience of knowing and the knowns.
Mm-hmm.
We've defined the mind as having at least four facets. Each of them may be emergent properties of energy. That's
Mm-hmm.
just a hypothesis,
Okay.
but they are subjective experience, consciousness. So we would say consciousness is an aspect of mind,
Mm-hmm.
information processing, and self organization. Those are the four facets.
Right.
So that isn't to say that for the panpsychic believers that consciousness is everywhere in the universe, that separates mind from consciousness. It just means that consciousness is fundamental to mind, and
Mm-hmm.
it may be that mind is tapping into consciousness that is possibly fundamental to the universe. So
Mm-hmm.
that's just a big open question.
Right.
So even though we include it as one of the aspects of mind, it doesn't mean that mind is a larger construct than consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The third thing you're bringing up is self. So the book I wrote, Interconnected, really wrestles with this question of what does that word really mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so I did a dive into indigenous teachings on self, contemplative teachings on self, and the science exploration of self. And being trained as an attachment researcher in that field of science, we would use terms like self regulation and self monitoring and self understanding, and in modern science and in maybe modern culture, we use the word self almost as a synonym for the individual,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so even a term like self-compassion, which tries to draw on contemplative practices, uses the word self for an identical meaning for the individual.
Mm-hmm.
So, I sat with that and I thought, well, is that really true? Is this notion of self, does it have to be the individual? Because if that's true, then that means that individualistic cultures somehow have a more correct way they use it, whereas self in a collectivistic culture is the group.
Mm-hmm.
So from an anthropological point of view, I started feeling like that's kind of arrogant
Mm-hmm.
to make self take the modern Western derived view of self means the individual. And so I started wrestling with that over many, many years, and you and I used to talk about this, and I certainly had a whole group of very, diverse group of individuals come to be in a book club.
Mm-hmm.
I said, let's have a book club for a book that hasn't been written yet. I want to hear your points of view on the chapters. Here are the 10 chapters, and you tell me what you like in this chapter. And they would discuss the contents of a chapter that they had
Mm-hmm.
never read. And it was absolutely fascinating. But one of the things that came up in that journey with those folks was, from lots of different perspectives, what people mean by self is the spa business you're talking about, subjective feeling of something, like the center of a subjective experience.
Mm-hmm.
P is the perspective from that center. So think of it just from a idea of a collection or a center, either geographic center or experiential center.
Mm-hmm.
And then A is agency. What do you act on behalf of? So
Mm-hmm.
then if you took the spa definition of self, subjective experience, the sensation of something, P, the perspective, the point of view, and agency, what do you act on behalf of? Then you could come to feel into the notion that the skull does not define that spa.
Mm-hmm.
The skin doesn't define the spa. It may be a part of it, but you can walk in a forest and you can feel the wholeness of that collection of trees and your body,
Mm-hmm.
the wholeness, intraconnected, not just interconnected. So it's not
Mm-hmm.
just like I'm there in the forest. It's I
Mm-hmm.
am the forest.
Mm-hmm.
And then it came to just become apparent that spa could be the intra-connected whole, and you would have like an identity lens that would allow you to say, just to put qualifying terms on it, I have an inner self, So I have a sensation, perspective, and agency inside this body, maybe even inside my head sometimes, but inside my skin encased body. That's the individual self, the personal
Mhm.
self. But then I have a relational self, like my whole history with you, Aldrich,
Mhm.
and what happens in the betweenness, right? That happens in the connection across time and space. That's Aldrich Dan, you know. So that has a relational fullness to it, and that would be one aspect of a spa.
Mhm.
That would be a self of us, Aldrich and Dan, and
Mhm.
then you would have this broader one, like of all living beings on Earth
Mhm.
that exists now in this Newtonian sense of now, and then
Mhm.
that has existed for all of our ancestors of
Mhm.
all species, and then
Mhm.
are going to go beyond our descendants. So
Right.
then you start like going across space and time like you do when you do the wheel of awareness. You get that feeling in the hub
Mhm.
because you get into that quantum state of where time does not exist. Time is not a variable in quantum
Mhm.
equations.
Mhm.
So then when you do the wheel every day, and I once did the wheel in a forest called the Pando Populous Forest, where the forest ranger who was there had never meditated before.
Mhm.
He, along with these 50 religious leaders, did the meditation. He comes out of it. Now it's time for people to share. This forest ranger is like in tears, and he says, this wheel of awareness is exactly why I'm devoting my life to being a forest ranger, in particular here at Pando,
Mhm.
because Pando Populous is this Utah forest, he says, where we have 48,000 seemingly separate, quote, trees,
Mhm.
but you go 6 inches beneath the surface and it's one root ball. And
Mhm.
we've tested the DNA all around the grove, and the DNA is identical in all the trunks.
Mhm.
It's the same tree. It's one of the largest and one of the oldest living things on earth. And he's now in tears. And the whole group is like, these are religious leaders and me, we're just like moved. And that's the feeling you get when you get into that hub, is
Right.
you come to realize that the self is, yes, in your body, and yes, it's in the forest. And
Right.
it's both, because you have an identity lens that you can adjust
Mhm.
with all sorts of practices. The wheel is just one of them.
Mhm.
And that's where spa is a more useful way of defining self. So that
Mhm.
self experience means there's a center of energy flow
Mhm.
that has a subjective sensation to it, a perspective and point of view,
Mhm.
and agency, and a source of being a center of initiative action.
Mhm.
That's the A of spa. And then what you do then is you say, I'm going to act to protect this forest, like that forest ranger was saying.
Right. Yeah, it's quite interesting. I have had several thoughts throughout this discussion. One of them is the idea that, the idea of differentiating or distinguishing between self and consciousness. Like when we look at lots of the psychedelic studies that are ongoing, and also meditation practitioners' experiences as well, it's is the notion of ego dissolution, right? And lots of people have been tons of reports about individuals who've experienced this, and what happens is that the narrative self, we might say, becomes silenced to some extent, and then all of a sudden they completely feel very much connected again with the world around them. It's not just an intellectual understanding, because we talked about the relational mind, and we know through science, factually speaking, that we are definitely more interconnected than I think most people experience within themselves. The question now is, how do we create a match that's more congruent? How do we live and experience ourselves closer to the facts? And I think, of course, one very important way is through meditation. Another way I think is interesting is through flow experiences, right? Wu Wei and in Taoism, where all that stuff comes from, really, this idea that at least from a brain perspective, lots of these centers related to filtration are very much silenced, and people end up experiencing timelessness and selflessness as well. And of course, with that comes simple connectedness with the world.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I would just modify perhaps the languaging of what you said. They
Mm,
experience separate selflessness. That is, a separate self dissolves, but they feel the subjective feeling, the perspective, and the agency often
mhm.
of being an expanded self.
So I wonder
Defining it
here.
that way.
So Dan, I actually wrote that in reassembling models. which is so funny that you said that. This idea of the self-expanding as opposed to self-transcendent experiences, that's a
Yeah.
different bit of a different subject, but connected. Um, but I do wonder, could that actually be a distinguishing factor between consciousness and the self, where consciousness continues, or we could say, and this just might be semantic, really, but where consciousness continues, but self dissipates.
Yeah, I think it is a semantic issue, actually. The way you're describing it, I think, is really totally solid if you're defining self as individual,
Right.
which is in modern culture, modern science, that's what we do.
Mm,
And even someone, when I was writing the book Interconnected, said, give it up, Dan. In developing mind, you pushed against mind being just brain activity and that work, that's fine. But self is too much a synonym for individual. Don't push against that. And
mm,
initially I thought, okay, I should not push against it. And I thought, well, I'll give it a try. So
mm,
I don't think it's catching on like the whole notion of mind being embodied and
mm.
relational did.
What do
But
you
that
what
doesn't
do
mean
you
it's not true.
what what do you think about consciousness being the sense of self, that which
Yeah,
sense?
I don't go with that. I'll tell you why I don't go with that.
Okay.
Um, unless you define consciousness being the way you have a subjective experience,
Mm,
then I'm fine with that. But if you're saying that consciousness, well, let me back up for a moment. You used a couple of terms I think that's worth coming back to and highlighting. We have a narrative sense of who we are
mm-hmm,
that says, I am Aldrich, I am Dan, this
mm-hmm,
is my history, this is where I'm at. I'm an attachment researcher. I got my whole, research fellowship becoming a narrative scientist.
mm-hmm,
So, we study the power of a parent's capacity to do an individual personal narrative, autobiographical narrative.
mm-hmm.
And when they make sense of their life, their child has the best opportunity to have a secure attachment with them and have positive
Right.
outcomes. If they haven't made sense of their life, their personal life, it makes a big difference. So when
Mm-hmm,
some of my Buddhist colleagues say to me, there is no self, and I go, well, actually, there is a personal self, there is a narrative self, and it's the best predictor of how that person's child turns out. So don't tell me there's no self. What
mm-hmm,
they mean is that, and when I've talked to students of Thich Nhat Hanh or when I've worked with the Dalai Lama, this is the notion of no self. Is there's no completely isolated separate self, which
right.
is true.
Mm-hmm,
You are layering both within you layers of your own internal self, but
mm-hmm,
there's also a relational self that is ignored often in the modern construction of a separate self.
mm-hmm,
So I know they're clunky wordings because it's easier. Some people have said to me, just give it up, Dan. Just let the word self mean the individual.
mm-hmm,
And when you talk about being part of the forest, just say you've lost yourself.
mm-hmm,
And I go, no, well, actually, you've found yourself. If the self
mm-hmm,
is the center of experience, which I think it really is, then when you come to embrace, as you do on psychedelics, for example,
mm-hmm.
and I just to give you just two parenthetic comments, I was teaching with Amishi Jha, who's right near you in Florida,
Yeah.
when she heard the proposal that the hub of the wheel correlates with maximal uncertainty of the plane of possibility. She
Mm-hmm,
went in a brain study to look at pure awareness and found the neural correlate of it in computerized EEG analysis. It
mm-hmm,
was the most uncommitted state. And
mm-hmm,
then I was meeting also in Florida, another meeting with Robin Carhart Harris, who's
mm-hmm,
studying psychedelics. And his whole theory of the entropic brain is exactly what you're talking about, that the
mm-hmm,
brain lets go of these filters of learned ways of perceiving the world and
mm-hmm,
drops into more openness. So I think what Robin Carhart Harris findings and Amishi Jha's findings show in terms of the Wheel of Awareness findings is that when you can relax those plateaus, we would call them in the diagram,
right.
and drop into the plane of possibility, the universe flows, in terms of your term flow, flows through you.
Mm-hmm,
And for artists that I work with, when they can tap into the hub of the wheel, that's a metaphor for the plane of possibility, the art comes through them. And they often describe the experience of, I'm not making this painting, I'm not making this poem, I'm not making this song.
mm-hmm,
The song is coming through me.
mm-hmm,
Then what I think they're talking about is letting the plateaus dissolve
mm-hmm,
and letting the natural drive for integration to be expressed through, if it's a painter, through her hands on the canvas.
Right.
If it's a musician like yourself, playing the guitar in a certain way.
Hmm.
Um, and it isn't just language, it's all these other ways where the universe can come through you. And in that way, you feel into a self, the center of experience, spa,
Hmm.
sensation, perspective, and agency. And when you're an artist doing that, or a writer, or whatever, you are letting the natural drive of a complex system called the universe, maybe not the universe, but your life in this universe,
Hmm.
letting it arise through you. And there's this incredible sense of joy,
Right.
connection, love that arises because it's all about linking with this care and this kindness. And I think that's really what the world needs. And so when I
Hmm.
read the psychedelic literature, or I read the importance of nature in people's lives, or I read about indigenous teachings, or I read
Hmm.
about contemplative findings, or I read about what the mental health field is struggling with, like,
Hmm.
I think it's struggling because
Yeah.
unfortunately the mental health field, and this is our field, so I feel sad to say this, it equated self with the individual, and then was looking for self-development and self-actualization, self-compassion, self this, self that,
Mm.
self-regulation, and I think we need to expand that definition of self, not make it an equal to the individual, and say,
Mhm.
yeah, you need to develop your different layers of self by developing this identity lens that allows you to realize you have an inner self. It is true. You have an inner self, and it's super important.
Mhm.
And you have a relational self that is true, and it's super important. And both are true and important.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot that goes into this. And just going back to what you said about indigenous cultures, when we look at hunter-gatherer literature, one of the findings that's quite salient throughout all of them, even in the modern day ones, of course, well, mainly the modern day ones because that's what we know of, mostly is just the idea that this sense of connectedness is with them, that they have it naturally, but at some point there was this disconnection. And that's really where my next book is really jumping into, where I come up with the sad theory for there was a separation, alienation, and then discord. And the separation portion begins with actually certain developments of the brain, like the default mode network that allows us to suspend the immediacy of space time and consider what's going on conceptually. But that in and of itself is totally okay, the development of narrative selves, because something separate can still be in harmony with other things. Um, then, and I'm not going to get too deep into this because the book's not out yet, but alienation comes in. I think coming in with the agricultural revolution and all sorts of other historical events that eventually leads to discord, which might involve things like the idea of the mind and the brain and the body being all separate entities in and of themselves, and dualism and all of these ideas that have permeated deeply into our culture. Um, so Dan, we're running close to our time because you need to leave in like 5 minutes. Is that
No,
correct?
no, I can't leave in 12 minutes. My relational self with my mom, who's going to be 96 next birthday,
Okay.
she's having severe dental problems. So there's an emergency dental visit that I'm going to pick her up and take her to the dentist to do what she's desperately not wanted to do, which
Okay.
is lose her teeth.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so anyway, so it's a big relational moment across time and space.
Mm.
And so I have 12 more minutes.
Okay. Okay.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, so let's continue on, but I'm going to save the last 5 minutes for our traditional rapid fire questions, which I
Okay.
ask of all my guests, which are kind of fun. Um, so we're on. I guess we're on the topic of separation of with nature now, and this experience of a separate self. So for you, the big part of the weight here is in the semantic use of the word self.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's take your great acronym SAD. I love that. Separation, alienation, and discord. No, what was it?
Yeah, and Discord. Yeah, yeah.
Discord.
So
Yeah,
each one has
It-
their own.
that's
Yeah,
a great welcome to the acronym addict club.
I learned from the best. I follow you in the footsteps here.
And there's in this personality wholeness and therapy book. It's I tried to avoid acronyms, but it turned out that Carol Dweck came up with a very similar theory after hours, and her great acronym in her theory is called BEATS, the personality beats of beliefs, emotions, and action tendencies, which I love,
Mm,
and they correspond to our adaptive strategies. But in terms of your question, and I just want to say this about the SAD acronym and the idea of a self and what we do with it. This cultural evolution that you're pointing to um, certainly could have to do with, in the personality literature, we talk about a narrative identity,
Hmm.
and they talk about, from a cultural perspective, something called a master narrative. So
Hmm.
it's like the messages you get in culture about, in this case, who you are. And in modern culture, and I once said this to the Dalai Lama, and he said, I said, oh, this master narrative essentially comes from the West. And he goes, don't say that. It may have come from there, but it's not just in the West. It's everywhere
Yeah,
on the planet now.
it's
And
modern.
my 15-year-old son, Alex, he was there, and he ribs me and he says, the Dalai Lama gotcha. So I don't say Western anymore, given the
Right.
Dalai Lama's editing of my comments that my son's ribbing me. But I say that because it's in modern culture. Let's just say that.
Hmm.
So we have a choice. We could just say, okay, semantically, let's reserve the word self for what modern culture tells us we are, the individual,
Hmm.
and let's try to encourage another word, whatever it would be, for what you stand up for and try to protect and live through and experience your self experience, all that stuff. So
Hmm.
I tried that on for a while, and I got really sad.
Hmm.
In your idea of sad, I got separated, right? I got this. What's the A for?
Alienation
I got
and then discord.
alienated. I got discord.
Yeah,
I
I think
felt really
everyone's on a
sad.
spectrum, but
What's
yeah,
that?
everyone's on a spectrum, but yeah,
Okay, yeah.
yeah.
So I felt really sad in your
Hmm.
way of saying that. So then I said, you know something? I'm going to go for it. I'm going to really try to make a pitch semantically
Hmm.
that, number one, we identify that we see self as a noun rather than a verb, and that's a fundamental problem.
Yeah, that's factually incorrect, really.
Yeah, exactly. It's
Yeah.
self-thing, if you had a word.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, that we equate self with the individual,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
And it's clunky semantically in terms of the languaging we do. But let's try this. Try as a challenge that every time you mean the individual and you're
Mm-hmm.
going to use the word self, just say personal self or
Hmm.
inner self or
Right.
individual self. That's cool. No one's trying to get rid of the importance of that.
Mm-hmm.
And let's try to use words like relational self, which means you with other people or you
Mm-hmm.
with the whole of nature.
Mm-hmm.
So we have these two things: a personal, inner,
Mm-hmm.
individual self.
Yeah, I like inner
You like inner?
experience, inner.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
inner.
that
So go
yeah,
with inner.
inner
So
outer.
go with
Yeah,
inner. So you have your inner self,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
and you have your relational stuff. That's it.
Yeah.
So it's not like that complicated. And the reason to do that is if self is sensation, perspective, and agency, just by this simple challenge that Aldrich and I can give you right now, where you say, for now on, anytime I want to just say the word self, I've got to qualify which one I mean.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm really wanting for inner development and inner discovery and inner understanding and inner regulation, call it inner self.
Mm-hmm.
Don't use a word like self compassion,
Right.
use inner compassion
Mm-hmm.
or inner self compassion.
Mm-hmm.
The reason for this is that when we have compassion for what we call another person, that other person is you.
Mm-hmm.
So let's stop othering. So then you say, okay, what about our, bless you, what about our relationship with all of nature? Well, that's your relational self. So you
Mm-hmm.
feel it, subjective experience. You take the perspective of the forest, other species, P, perspective,
Mm-hmm.
agency. You act on behalf of it. And when people start living with this identity lens where they can get it up close for inner,
Yeah.
expand it out for relational, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Life starts to get freer and
Mm-hmm.
fuller and have more meaning and purpose and connection.
Mm-hmm.
And people stop feeling sad.
Right. Right. I think it's great, this emphasis on language use. It tends to be underestimated, the impact that it has on us. Even this
Oh, my.
idea of like having no words for something a little bit before anxiety, right? If someone is feeling anxious, if they tell themselves they're anxious, it's going to lead to a particular subset of different activities or behaviors that they'll engage in. Versus if they said, "I just feel aroused right now," or "I'm
Yeah.
feeling in
Energize,
some way
energize. Yeah.
energized." Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's
Yeah.
it's a different. It makes you forage for information, maybe, or do something differently. And yeah, this constraint of self is quite restricting, and as you said, it's selfing if anything. But there's also a very nice parallel here. I just want to note between what you're mentioning and the work of George Northoff, who's become a pretty close colleague of mine, and and basically he says that the most fundamental nature of self is coming from what he calls the neuroecological level, which is brain entrained or synchronized with the environment. And these are things that are measurable, and that when you look at many conditions, you could sometimes find entropic signatures and such in that deep connection. But anyways, the point here is
That's
the
beautiful. That's
connection,
great.
right, between
Yeah.
brain and
Well,
environment. It's all very connected.
and to remind everybody, and
Mm,
here's the big conceptual shift. When you think of our lives as energy flow, you no longer see them as constrained by skull or skin,
mm,
because energy passes through the skull and through the skin, and it embeds us in the whole universe. And if you want to just stay on Earth, it embeds us to all living things on Earth.
mm,
And so this is where I know when I first proposed this in the 90s, people would roll their eyes and say, why are you talking about energy flow? And I've even recently had neuroscientists chase me down hallways, say, stop talking about energy flow, stop talking about energy flow. I said, man, you had a lot of energy to say that to me, didn't you? And it gets them so irritated. But the movement from mind being just in your head to mind being an emergent property of energy liberates us to, I think, get closer to the truth. And self is the same thing.
mm.
Let's keep the word, let's keep the linguistic symbol, and try the challenge out, see how it goes. So every
Right.
time you mean the inner aspect, just say inner self or inner experience or something. And every time you mean relational, say relational
Hmm.
self,
Yeah.
and try it out and get back to Aldrich and see what it's like to try on this challenge. We'll call it the inner relational self challenge.
It's a good one. It's a good one. Um, okay, Dan. So now what I'd like to do is we have only 3 minutes left, so I want to transition us to these rapid fire questions. But
Okay,
yeah,
I think I'm ready, but I don't know. We'll
okay,
see how it goes.
yeah. Some intellectuals will not like these first few questions, but nonetheless, I've subjected others to these torture as well. All right.
And you want me? I don't know what you're about to do. So you want me just to give my first response, or to
Yeah.
wait and think about it?
First response, whatever comes to mind.
Okay.
Okay.
Now that we know what mind is, we can say what comes to mind.
Okay. Uh, whatever inner experience you have. All right.
Okay.
Name a book you love.
A book I love?
Yeah.
Oh my God. To Bless the Space Between Us by John O'Donohue.
Okay. Name a source of inspiration.
You inspire me, Aldrich.
Oh, that's very flattering, Dan. Okay.
It's
What did
true.
you what did you want to be when you were a child?
When I was a child, I actually wanted to be a director,
Hmm.
probably to direct my family to behave themselves more appropriately. But I wanted to be a director. Yeah.
Interesting. Like of a play or movies or
Like a TV director, make
maybe there.
shows so that life could turn out differently than I had a hard childhood, and I wanted to be different.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's your favorite type of music?
My favorite type of music is Alex Siegel's music. My son is a musician. I
Correct
am
response.
obsessed with it. Try it out, Alex Siegel, on all the ways you can channel music.
Okay. Name a song you very much enjoy.
Oh my God, I love a song that just came out from Alex called "Sentimental."
Hmm.
It's about relationships, and
Hmm.
it's really gorgeous. Yeah,
By the way, when you mentioned a neuroscientist chasing you down the hall, and you're saying, "Well, there's a lot of energy," I was once told, and I told this to Stephen Hayes also, that someone once told me that emotions are energy in motion, and
yeah,
I
that's
thought,
nice.
yeah, I always thought that was a really nice one.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, do you believe in God?
I believe in the generator of diversity. And for
Hmm.
me as a scientist who communicates a lot with religious leaders, including my dear friend John O'Donohue, who was a Catholic priest, that conceptualization of a generator of diversity being the plane of possibility, I deeply believe in.
Hmm.
And it fits with indigenous teachings, contemplative teachings, and religious teachings, and it fits with science. So
Right.
So I would say I believe in the generator of diversity as what
Okay.
people mean when they say the word God.
Interesting. That's also very much fits with the work of Alfred North Whitehead. He believed creativity was at the center of it all, and which is quite similar, I
Oh,
think.
very similar. Yeah, the
Yeah,
God, the generator of diversity. Yeah.
good one. All right. Name something unique about yourself.
Oh my gosh. I would say if there's anything unique, maybe it's I dropped out of medical school to become a dancer.
Hmm. Okay, that is unique. That's a good one. Would you say our universe is meaningful or meaningless, or both?
Meaningful.
Okay.
Yeah. And meaning comes from integration, and it's deeply integrative, this universe.
Okay. And what is the purpose of human life?
I think the purpose of human life, and I write about this in a book called, I guess, Mind, is to try to bring more integration into the world,
Hmm.
which is ultimately kindness and compassion.
Hmm. Okay. Excellent. Well, that sums it up. Thank you so much, Dan, for coming here today. Well, coming onto this podcast with me today. I really appreciate your time and all your wisdom, and I'm sure that anyone watching this would say the same thing. So, um, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Aldrich. It's an honor to be with you, and thanks. And I'll look forward to our next conversation.
Absolutely. Okay.